Welcome back to the channel. I'm Callum, and in this video you're going to be getting to know my opinions a little bit better. That's because what I'm going to be doing is going through who, in my humble opinion, is the best character from a number of different fandoms. Now before I start on that though, remember these are my opinions. I don't expect you'll agree with me, because to be honest with you, on a lot of them, I don't really even agree with myself. You'll see what I mean as we go forward, but before that, let's roll those titles. Before we begin, if you haven't already, please do go check out my latest streaming pigs video, if you want to hear me blathering on about a whole bunch of other stuff that I like. The link to that will be up in the cards above. Now with all that out of the way, I'm going to jump straight in with the brand that is plastered across my chest right now, and tell you that my choice for the Star Wars canon is Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Hello there.
Now why did I choose Obi-Wan Kenobi? It's probably partially because of the kid inside of me who's always loved Obi-Wan Kenobi as a character. I bought the Obi-Wan game on the Xbox, I've always chosen to play as him on Battlefront, etc. I just think he's a great character, played brilliantly by both Ewan McGregor and Alec Guinness. I just think that he's this fantastic tie-in to Star Wars that sort of makes you see how cool the Jedi are. Even though a lot of his sort of opinions and a lot of the stuff that he does, in a way, causes their downfall. But the main reason why I chose Obi-Wan Kenobi isn't because of the childhood nostalgia. It's because of the potential that his character holds. Now I'm sure that you're aware that they've picked up Obi-Wan Kenobi to be part of his own standalone series on Disney+. I am thrilled about that. I've always loved the character, I love Ewan McGregor, it's just a match made in heaven. And I think the big thing about this is going to be how they show what Obi-Wan Kenobi was up to in the years between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope. I think it could tell a really interesting story where he maybe plays some kind of like sheriff who's marshalling the towns of Tatooine, and he goes around putting out fires and all that kind of stuff. I think he's a really good character, and I really think there's a lot to explore. For that reason, Obi-Wan Kenobi is an obvious choice for my favourite Star Wars character. Next up is probably, at least in the last 20 years or so, the biggest fandom out there. I'm going with Marvel. Now my choice for Marvel is an interesting one because it's not sort of one of the traditional superheroes, and not even someone who's sort of in the main MCU movies. That's because my choice is from Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and if you watch my last video you'll know I'm fond of that show, and it's Alphonso Mackenzie, who I think is a fantastic character. Now Alphonso Mackenzie, or Mac as he's known in the series, is played by Henry Simmons. Henry Simmons puts in a fantastic performance. He's not one of the original cast, but he came in and he made a real big impact. So much so that his character actually became the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. in later seasons. Now the thing I like about this character is the fact that he really sort of represents what the show is supposed to be about. Mac doesn't have any superpowers, he's a fairly ordinary guy who just works for S.H.I.E.L.D. and he's just a loyal agent. And that's the thing about his character at the end of the day. What he offers to the show is he shows a sort of grounded sort of sense of the world of the Marvel Universe, which is exactly what it set out to do from the beginning. In more recent series where they sort of went along the superhero route and more of the characters had their own powers, he remained as this sort of one object that was always a constant and was always a good character who gave a lot of laughs, a lot of sort of badass moments, and I just think overall he really just gives this humanity to the series and to the MCU as a whole. Now my first dilemma came from the Wizarding world. And that's because if you know me, you know that I have a Noble Collection Sirius Black one somewhere on that bookshelf behind me. However, I didn't choose Sirius Black as the best character, even though I love him. Who I chose instead was Remus Lupin. Now in case you live under a rock, Remus Lupin was the third year Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher during Harry's time at Hogwarts. He was friends with Harry's dad, one of the Marauders, and he also turns into a werewolf. Now those things alone are good enough reasons to choose him as the best character. He's got a lot of depth, a lot of connection to the main characters. But I think what's really interesting about him is what happened between the First Wizarding War and when he was hired at Hogwarts. Now the main thing that I think separates Remus Lupin and Sirius Black is that kind of mystery. The problem is with Sirius Black is that a lot of his story is already accounted for. We already know that he was a marauder at school, he graduated, became a part of the Order of the Phoenix, and then he supposedly betrayed the Potters, went to Azkaban, escaped from Azkaban, and then that's where we see him in the main timeline. The thing is with Remus Lupin, however, is a lot of that chunk of time when Sirius is in Azkaban is kind of not known about him. We know that he couldn't really get a job because he was a werewolf, and we know that he spent a lot of that time actually homeless, living on people's couches, anyone that he could. Now what's interesting about this time is that really Remus didn't have anyone to turn to. Obviously his friends the Potters had both just died, Sirius was now locked away, and Peter Pettigrew was believed to be dead. Most of the other members of the Order had been killed or gone into hiding, so he couldn't really rely on anyone. This was also before the Weasleys were really even part of the whole Order of the Phoenix in general. Now all of this mystery really adds to his character, and there's a lot of potential to explore some of the events that happened throughout this time. Not only that, but also what we know about him in the films and the books is already a really great story. His whole relationship with Tonks and the sort of fact that he dies in the battle leaving his son as a sort of mirror image to Harry is a really emotional storyline. And I think Remus really has a lot of depth to him that isn't explored enough already. Now I pick from DC, and I haven't gone with the DCEU per se. I mean, the character is in the DCEU, however, I don't really like his portrayal so far, at least. Now that character is Cyborg. Now it probably won't surprise you to hear that I was a big fan of the Teen Titans animated series growing up. I loved it, I loved all the characters, I loved the animation style, and I loved the storylines that they told. And because of that, my favourite character was definitely Cyborg. Cyborg had this really emotional story where he was sort of questioning his identity, whether or not he was human still, or whether or not he was more of a robot these days. I think that this sort of weird morality that he had to deal with was a real big part of his character and something that sort of set him apart from a lot of the other sort of more human people throughout the show. Now I think Cyborg is a really interesting character to look into in general. Before his accident, he was an American football player, a very good one at that, but unfortunately with the injuries that he sustained, he needed to undergo a lot of surgery, and his father as a sort of experimental scientist turned him into what he is today, a cyborg. Now what's interesting about him is that this weird complex relationship he has with his father, who both saved his life and also made him inhuman, is what really drives his character a lot in the comic books at least. And we sort of get glimpses of that from the animated series. However, they sort of went in and took his story from the Teen Titans series and sort of made that into a film. I think they could really explore him as a character, still tell a lot about his backstory, but also about this sort of moral choice that he has to make as to whether he really identifies as a human. I think Cyborg is a fantastic character with a lot of depth and a lot of intrigue, especially for a character who's sort of supposed to be aimed at teens and kids. Now this thing that everyone thinks is true, that Star Wars fans can't also like Star Trek, is just wrong. I love both, and I don't think I know anyone who likes one and not the other. Now, I've watched every single series of Star Trek, all of the spin-offs with all of the different captains and all of the different ships. I love every single one of them, and all of them have their selling points. My favourite character though is from Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and it's Benjamin Sisko. Now Benjamin Sisko is interesting for a number of different reasons. He holds a lot of firsts in the Star Trek universe. He's the first African American captain, the first captain who is a father, and not only that, he's also the first captain in the show that isn't the captain of a ship per se. Obviously he captains the Defiant when they go out on missions, but mostly he's in charge of a space station. Now it's not only down to him as to why I think he's a great character, I think he's also in probably the best series. Star Trek Deep Space Nine has always been my favourite, and it's always the series that I go back to rewatch first. I'll obviously give Voyager another go as well, and then probably go straight into Next Generation. However, Deep Space Nine, first on the list, every time. He's got a fantastic group of supporting characters, Bashir, O'Brien, he even gets Worf. Like, he's one of the only characters who sort of goes over from a number of different series. I think Cisco, though, is definitely the pick of the bunch. He has a really interesting story, and the family dynamics that are explored through him are really integral to the show and really set him apart as a captain. Now, Cisco's one of a few characters, and especially one of very few captains, who you can really see having a life outside of Starfleet. Now, what really sets him apart is the sort of moral dilemmas that he has to deal with on a regular basis. All captains have to make moral decisions. However, he really has to weigh up the safety of his son and his family as a whole when making those. As emissary as well, he has this whole sort of religious arc that's part of his character. I think it sort of adds another facet to him that makes him a really interesting person to look into. There's also a lot of lore that connects him to the wider Star Trek universe, and I think that if you wanted to, you could do exactly what Amazon have done, and you could take Ben Sisko and do a standalone series about him as well. I think he's a fascinating character who I'd really love to look into. Now time for my next dilemma, which was the Lord of the Rings franchise. And the reason why this one was a difficult decision is because there aren't really many characters who I want to see more of. Not because I don't like them, but because they've already kind of been explored in other texts and throughout the series as a whole. However, my choice for the Lord of the Rings franchise is Legolas. And mostly because Legolas is a badass. I'm just going to remind you of a couple of things that he did, alright? He took an orc shield, surfed down a staircase while firing bows into the army. Fantastic. Secondly, he takes down an Oliphant single-handedly, climbing up its leg, shooting it in the back of the head, and then sliding down its trunk like it's a wave. Ridiculous. And then finally, when he destroys a bridge and then hops from stone to stone as the bridge collapses, completely defying the laws of physics. Who cares? It's Legolas, he's a badass, no explanation needed. Now changing things up a little bit, I'm going to talk about video games. Now, I haven't talked about video games much on the channel at all yet, however I'm looking to in later videos. The video game series I'm going to be talking about is one of my favourites, and one of the best in terms of storytelling, which is why I included it in this list. That game series is Mass Effect, and the character I'm going with is Garrus Vakarian. For those of you unfamiliar with the Mass Effect series, it's about a character called Commander Shepard who has to basically save the world from these creatures called the Reapers, which are these sort of big machine robot things. Now, Garrus is a Turian, which is an alien species in this world, in this universe, should I say. Garrus is a Turian agent who has worked for a number of different security services, including the Turian military and a number of others as well. However, his character is kind of outside of the law a lot of the time. He doesn't like to be restricted by rules. Because of this, you're likely to form quite an attachment to Garrus as a character. You'll be wanting to do a lot of his side quests in order to up his friendship, and if you play as Fem Shepard, you might even want to romance with him. He's very charming. I think Garrus is a great character who is really exemplary of the Mass Effect series. The Turians are a big, iconic aspect of Mass Effect, just as the Wookiees are to Star Wars. I think Garrus is a great character who's got a lot of depth and a lot to him that I think could really well be explored if they were to come back to the series another time. Now moving into the wonderful animated world of Pixar, and in particular, The Incredibles. Now, The Incredibles is my favourite Pixar film. I've always loved superheroes, as you can probably tell from the rest of this list, and I've always loved the sort of more character-driven stories throughout Pixar. The person I've chosen from this film is Syndrome. Now, this probably won't surprise a lot of you. He's often debated as the best Pixar villain, and actually sometimes as the best superhero villain in general. The thing about Syndrome that really sets him apart is that he has a real motivation behind him. Now, his ambition is really tangible, and it comes from a really real place. Because he was ridiculed by Mr. Incredible when he was younger, he has this sort of hatred of superheroes. And I think that that's quite realistic given the circumstances. He was told that he wasn't good enough, and that he wasn't special. And so because of that, he set out to make everybody special so that no one would be. I think that this is a really good, interesting point about him, and I think it really shows that there's a sort of sympathy towards him. However, obviously his methods become a little bit extreme. The devastation that he causes on the city at the end is pretty much unforgivable, and a lot of the stuff that he does in general, killing off all the superheroes in order to test his robot, is definitely inexcusable. However, his motivations as a villain, and if we're taking it as that, as a villain, are second to none. He's up there with Killmonger and Thanos in terms of people who are sort of revered as those #1 villains in all superhero movies. And that definitely makes him a character that is worth exploring a bit more. Because of all that, Syndrome is my #1 choice in terms of a Pixar character. Next up, it's Doctor Who. Now, I love Doctor Who. Ever since its revival in 2005, I've been a big fan of it. And there's one character who I think doesn't get enough recognition. He certainly gets overlooked in the series and put down quite a lot, to be honest with you, and that character is Mickey Smith. Now, before I get into it, I know that there's a lot of rumours that Mickey was cheating on Rose, and I would never condone it. However, you can almost understand why he might have done so. Throughout the series, he gets sort of abandoned by Rose. He's sort of left on Earth while she goes off on these adventures, and she never even really gives him a second thought. It's also not confirmed whether he actually does even cheat on her. It's just sort of alluded to when they have that sort of breakup episode, that really weird one set in Cardiff. Despite this, however, I think Mickey's a really interesting character. I think, as I said, he gets overlooked a lot by both the Doctor and Rose, and to be honest with you, kind of bullied by them. I think it's good that he gets a redemption. It's good that he gets to go off to the parallel universe and become this sort of badass version of himself, where he can really fend for himself and he doesn't even really need Rose anymore. I think again, he's one of those characters who has a lot of potential. You could really explore a lot of different parts of his life, whether that be his life in the parallel universe without Rose, his life there when she gets there as well, or maybe that section of time where he joins Torchwood. I know it's touched on a little bit in the Torchwood series, but I would love to see him and Martha Jones going around defeating Sontarans and doing whatever else they do together. I think he really deserves that. Now, the last fandom on this list was a tricky one, mostly because I couldn't really decide which fandom to go for. I was umming and ahhing between Pirates of the Caribbean. Problem with that is I probably would have chose Will Turner, and I can't have 2 Orlando Blooms on this list. Another option was Alex Rider or the Umbrella Academy, but what I settled on was The Boys, and the character I'm going with is Billy Butcher, played by Carl Urban. Now, Billy Butcher is a very interesting character. In the TV show, he's a former CIA agent, and in the comic books, the original comic books, he was a former Royal Marine. The only reason why this change was made is because the setting went from being sort of more England-based into being American. Now, what's interesting about Billy is that he sort of has this weird resentment towards superheroes, but it doesn't stem from anything like Syndrome's motivations in Pixar. Instead of it being sort of a thing against their powers and the power that they have in general, which comes into it later on when they're sort of abusing those powers they have. Instead, it comes from a much more personal place. Now, I won't get into the details of why exactly he hates superheroes. If you want to know, you can either watch the show or go into the comics. But basically, there's a really personal reason involving his wife as to why he resents the leader of the superheroes in the show. And because of that, that motivates all his actions and wants him to get his revenge and sort of get back at them in a really personal way. Now, all this makes him a really interesting character, but you're probably thinking it's not making him very likeable, but I think what does that is the performance from Carl Urban in the TV series. Now, Carl Urban has always been a fan favourite actor. He's liked in almost everything that he does, whether that's Dredd, whether that's as Éomer in Lord of the Rings, going back to one of my other choices, or whether that's here in The Boys as Billy Butcher. Now, he plays off the other characters really well, and he portrays a sort of badass persona who's also, he's kind of funny, you know? His sort of weird motivations behind stuff sort of makes him this weird caricature of a person. A little bit like Woody Harrelson's character in Zombieland, who's only motivated by wanting to get a Twinkie. His sort of weird dedication to the art of killing superheroes makes him a really weird character, but someone that you kind of side with. You get his motivations, you realise the superheroes are corrupt, and you want him to win out, even though he's quite violent, quite brass, and quite rude. Okay, that's it for this video. What did you think of the idea? If you like this, I might do a few more of these videos where I explore other fandoms, other films, other TV series, and many other different aspects, and come up with my favourite characters or what I think are the best characters from those things. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and also tell me what you think in the comments below. Do you think there's anyone else in any of these fandoms who could be explored better? I would love to hear your opinions. Also, if you can, please consider donating to my Ko-fi page. As it stands, these videos don't generate any income, but I would really love to keep producing content for you guys. If you like some of the stuff I'm coming up with, please consider donating as little as £3, which is just the price that you would pay if you were buying me a coffee in Starbucks. Thank you so much for all the support on the channel so far, and I'll see you next week.